Welcome, everybody, to the second lecture of this lecture series, mainly aimed at the GameLAB teams of this year's batch. Um, Recommended for the entire teams and hopefully useful and informative, but really mandatory for the team leads and the producer types in the teams to better manage your teams. If you haven't seen part one, I suggest you go to the YouTube channel for GameCity Kajaani and take a look. We talked there about some topics that make it easier to follow today's presentation. And like last time, happy to take questions both in voice and in chat. And every now and then I will pause and ask you difficult questions as well. But let's get going. So, welcome to the second part. This is me again, some of the stuff I've done over the years, pretty much across all platforms in multiple countries, in multiple different studios, worked on many big games, such as some of the biggest games coming out of Finland during the time that they came, such as Alan Wake 1 and Alan Wake 2, but also worked at EA, Next Games, Wargaming, and so forth, PC, console, mobile, pre-iPhone and post-iPhone, free-to-play, premium, you name it. So I have experience from many different kinds of team sizes, project sizes, and platforms over the years. Today I'm working, my day job is at Housemarque, and we are just about to release a game called Saros later this month. You're all excited about doing it, and somebody dares to come in late. It's Jussi who already dropped out once. Unfortunately, I always have to let you all in one by one, so I really ask you to be on time and not drop out if at all possible, because it does disrupt the flow for everybody else when I have to go in and let everybody in one by one. So, like I was saying, my day job is these days at Housemarque, and we're just about to release a game called Saros on PlayStation 5 later this month. Hopefully, you're all very excited about it. But today, I'm not here to represent Sony, PlayStation, nor Housemarque in my opinions. My opinions and thoughts here that I'm presenting are completely my own, and they only reflect my opinions and the opinions of my own company called JR Game Consulting. So, just the legal caveat that I always need to get out of the way to make clear that I'm representing myself and not Sony here. So last year, I only managed to give one lecture to the GameLAB program. That video is also available on the GameCity YouTube channel, talking about short-term agile project management. This year's lecture series has a lot more content, most of it by your request or request by the teams from last year who didn't get all of the information. That's why I've also invited many of the incubation and accelerator teams to join to get a deeper insights into project planning and road mapping. And like I already mentioned, we had a lecture last week where we focused on certain topics, the part one. So go check those both out on the YouTubes. Last week, we talked about the GameLAB year, what Q2 and Q3 are going to hold for you. We talked about the fact that some teams might be voted off the island, so to speak, based on the coach feedback to the program. So please take our coaching seriously, as we will be evaluating your teams along the way. We want to make sure that the money invested into this program is put towards the teams who can take the best benefit out of it, because ultimately the program is aiming to turn you into game studios that make commercially viable games and generate jobs and tax revenues for our investors into the program. We also talked about why do we need project management and how do we build and maintain a product backlog that will work as the backbone for driving your product forward. And I can see from some of the Discord chats that some of the teams have already started taking some of the advice into account and started to build their product backlogs. And that's exactly what I am aimed by this. By breaking this down across multiple weeks, you can always take concrete actions based on every week's lecture to put your project in better shape before the next lecture is delivered. So I'm glad to see that in some teams is already happening. That's great to see. This week, we will be talking about the basic iterative loop. How do you plan one? How do you monitor one? What's the role of dailies in that? How do you adjust the iteration when it's not going according to the original plan? And then how do you review those iterations when you finish them? And like always, be asking you questions, explaining you the why, not just the what of why we're doing these things. But let's start with the first question of the day for you guys. The basic iterative loop. What is an iterative loop? What do you understand by those words? User's network dropped again. Anybody have any thoughts? What do we mean by iterative loop? What do those words mean for you? Have you ever heard of them in the context of game development? Cycle of steps that repeat again and again. Yes. Iterative refers to that loop of doing it again and again. I am now trying to let Jussi back in. Now I get a gazillion pop-ups. Hey, Jussi, hopefully you can stay online. If not, you can watch the video later. A sprint, a time when you make the game better by way how you decided. Yes, a sprint is an example of an iterative loop. But even if you don't use sprints, even if you don't use Scrum, we usually use iterative loops in development. We work a little bit, we look at the results, we adjust our plans accordingly, and we do a similar loop again and repeat those actions. Why? Why do we develop games that way? I know I ask you why a lot, but it's important for you to understand why we're doing these things, especially when you find them difficult and they work, and you get the temptation that if we just programmed harder, if we just made more art assets, if I just noodled the numbers on my Excel sheet more, we would ship the game faster. It's good to remember why we do these things. They're not being done because somebody in your business environment or your teacher is telling you you have to do. You're doing them as your independent owned company because they're beneficial to you. Fail fast, yes, that is part of it. The sooner you know that you're going in the wrong direction, you can adjust your direction and stop wasting time and money. Anything else? It helps to identify weak spots early enough and make changes accordingly when needed. It helps to improve product and utilize early feedback. Risk management, yes. All are good answers. You do it all over again until you can get it right. Yes, that's a good quote. You're all correct. At the end of the day, game development is very unpredictable. I have never, in my 20 plus years of working games professionally, shipped the game that we initially thought we were going to ship. It always adjusts along the way as we learn about the game. And at the end of the day, game development is about learning. The game is teaching you about where is it going and how to make it better. The players who play the game give you feedback that can make your game better. The tasks that you do teach you more about what other tasks you need to do. Our abilities develop, especially early in our careers. We can challenge ourselves to keep learning and improving, and then we can, over time, make better and better games as we learn more skills as developers. So to deal with that learning and taking those learnings into account and adjust our plans based on those, we need some sort of interactive, iterative thing that we can adjust along the way. We don't want to just fire and forget plans, that we make a very long-term plan and then we just focus on executing it. That's not the best way forward for game development, nor for our learning. So that unpredictability is forcing us to make shorter-term plans, then re-inspect the situation, and then potentially plan again for the next iteration. And we call it inspect and adapt. You do something, you inspect the results, and you adapt to those results. It's a very common basic agile practice, and its emphasis is to maximize the learning we do while minimizing the waste. The sooner we realize we're going in the wrong direction, we can stop and change direction as we do. And that's why even within those iterative loops, we want to have loops within loops, that we inspect our own work and try to evaluate, are we still on track to hit the plan? If not, how do we react to that? So if we think about that loop at a conceptual level and how to build such a loop for game development or for any goal-oriented effort, you set a goal that you start aiming for. But before you start working towards that goal, you build a plan. How do you think you're going to get to that goal? You need to be at the office by 9 a.m. because that's your first meeting. So you have to plan, when do you wake up? What route do you take? Do you take the bus, or do you walk or bike or drive? And all of that taken into account. Changing from one bus to another takes 5 minutes, but if the bus is late, I better build a 15-minute buffer, and then you build this plan to be on time. If you just wake up that morning having not thought at all how to get to work, you will most likely miss that 9 o'clock meeting. But then when you start going to work, you have to monitor and adjust. Maybe there's roadworks and you have to change the route you were planning to take with your car. Maybe your car breaks down and you have to call an Uber. Or maybe the train is late and you have to take a bus instead. You have to be able to adjust to your situation and still maximize your chances of being on time at work if it's an important meeting. And ultimately, you then deliver on what you planned against. Hopefully, that plan that you delivered against actually reached your goal. Sometimes in game development, it doesn't, so you have to then evaluate it. But it's also very important to also remember to celebrate those moments, because game development can be hard. It's important sometimes to stop and celebrate the achievement you've already done, appreciate the work you've done, and then move forward again. So take those small micro moments to celebrate the progress you're making. And then you go back to the thing, you set another goal, and you start planning against that goal, and you repeat this loop again and again and again over time. And that's the very basis of how we build agile workflow. We have this loop of iterating on the game, and many of us do that naturally before we've heard of Agile, before we've heard of Scrum, before we heard of any of these fancy terms. We work on the game, we play the game, we work more on the game. That's a very natural thing to do, even as a solo amateur developer, hobbyists. But then when you work in a team, it's important that you work together. So you have to add a loop of regular communication to stay in sync. You can't just go into your room, lock the door, and keep programming and not communicating with the rest of your team, or you're not going to ever finish the game. You're going to everybody be working on a different game. And we talked about the importance of planning. You can't just iterate day by day without a plan. You have to every now and then stop, plan a little ahead. Okay, I need to be there at 9. I need to plan this whole thing out. Then I start executing against it. I stay in constant communication with my teammates. And as soon as we realize that the plan is no longer achievable, that there's a risk to achieving that plan, we have to inspect, do we want to change the plan? Or do we want to approach the plan differently to still try to hit the original goal? Or do we have to even go and change the goal because the goal is no longer achievable? Because there's no point in finishing your 2-week sprint if you already know 3 days into the sprint that the sprint is going to fail. It's better to say that out loud and plan a sprint that can succeed. And then at the end of each sprint, while you've done that inspection along the way, you have sort of a bigger inspection where you review your results at the end of that sprint. Did we really achieve not just the plan, but the original goal we set? Is the game better? Did we accomplish those things that we wanted for the game or not? And that often takes some form of play testing the game, having discussions about it, and then that should feed back into your next planning cycle and adjust based on what the game is teaching you, what the goal, what you are learning as a team and as individuals along the way. And then for you to keep improving as a team and an organization, you also have to have that retrospective element where we look at not just how is the game proceeding, but how is our work going? Are there ways we could improve the way we work? And that retro can result in another loop going, which is finding ways to improve the way you work, making those improvements, and then in the next retro, inspect the results of that loop, whether your team is now working better or not. Because you have to accept that sometimes the changes you want to make, whether that's to the game or to the way you work, are going to take you to worse directions rather than better direction. And you might have to even cancel those changes and go back to the previous build or the previous way of working because it's pushing you in the direction that is not beneficial for making you a well-functioning team. And then if we formalize those things in agile practices, we often call them daily stand-ups. Daily stand-ups means you do them daily or very close to daily, very regularly. How often do you have to have them depends on how much communication you have to have. If you're failing on your goals, if you don't feel like you're on the same page, if you don't feel like you're working as a team, then you're probably not communicating enough and you need to do more of that. And we call them stand-ups because if we just stand up instead of sitting down, that forces us to keep the meeting short and focused. It's better to have a quick daily catch-up and maybe recognize, these particular items needs more time and discussion, but it doesn't actually involve the entire team. You, and you, the three of you can figure it out after this and spend some time together and then maybe sit down and have a longer sit-down meeting instead of trying to handle it with everybody present if it's not touching on every team member. And that way you save and respect other people's time by keeping those syncs short. I'd rather you do more short syncs more often than more detailed syncs less often, if that makes sense. So have those two, have the regular syncs and keep them as lightweight as possible, and then follow up on those with longer meetings and collaborations if and when needed, which don't usually need to involve the entire team. If somebody's just sitting there staring at their phone, they're either not engaging with you as a team, which might be a problem, or the specific topic isn't relevant to them, and you should excuse them from that discussion so the people who are actually engaged do it. But if you don't have those regular sync points, you don't know which discussions involve everybody and which don't. So keep those two things separate. And if you do all of this, you're doing Scrum, which some of you might have already noticed. So it might sound complicated, but it's actually very elegant and simple solution with very few parts that can be easily removed without breaking the system. And so understanding the why behind each part of those is important for you to be really motivated to do them well. Very often I see teams trying to optimize certain things. And the first thing people try to get rid of is the daily stand-ups. Can we just send Discord messages or Slack messages instead? Sure, but usually it doesn't work out well. First of all, people don't read those Slack messages, people don't react to them. Over time, people stop sending those messages and the communication starts to fall apart. And you're no longer working as a team, you're just working as individuals. And then you're all disappointed at the end of the sprint that you didn't accomplish the things you were supposed to together. Might sound familiar to some of you. If we then add the grooming in there for maintaining that product backlog and then long-term plan is something we discussed last week when we talked about backlog and its maintenance. That's not strictly part of Scrum, it's not described in Scrum, but it is one of the first things that most Scrum teams do. Because Scrum in itself is only telling you how to run and plan 2-week cycles. It doesn't tell you how to really put multiple 2-week cycles in a row and have a longer term plan. And if you look at my lecture for the GameLAB last year, we just talked about the Scrum cycle and that 2-week iteration. And we never got to the follow-up lecture for logistical reasons, where we would have talked about how do you then string these things together. So what are the elements that make up this Scrum cycle, which is one way of doing the iterative loop? And the important thing here is the iterative loop, but like I said last time, for each of these areas, I'm teaching you one way of doing it, or maybe a couple if it's fast to teach. I'm not teaching you all the possible ways you could be doing it. So Scrum is just one way, but a very often used and functional way of doing it. So the first element that Scrum has are ceremonies. What are ceremonies? Ceremonies, maybe just a fancier word for meeting? Well, not necessarily. Ceremonies is implying that it's multiple people working together based on a certain structured approach to it. There's certain agreed steps that we do. We don't just get into a room together and start vibing it. We have certain agenda. How do we drive this? What are the outcomes and goals we're expecting from this? And those things make people in room together from a generic meeting to a well-functioning, well-designed ceremony that is there for a certain purpose and run in a certain way. So these are also examples of ceremonies in the Scrum cycle: the planning meetings, the grooming sessions, the daily stand-ups, as well as the reviews and retros. So I would try to avoid using the word meeting to mean generally every time people get together, because then people just complain that they have too many meetings. I would focus on every ceremony having a very specific purpose, having a very specific structure that is being used for very specific reasons, and then using the retros to improve them over time. The other aspects that make this system are artifacts. Artifacts is anything that we generate as a team. So one of the artifacts is the product backlog that we talked about last week, and how you build that and maintain that in those grooming sessions. Then you take part of that backlog into your sprint planning meeting that you plan that you intend to plan in more detail for that sprint. We often call that the product increment. That's another example of an artifact. Out of your sprint planning comes a more detailed sprint backlog. That's another artifact that you're generating. You usually use burn down charts to measure and track whether you are on track to hit your goals or not. Remember that monitoring part. This is the monitoring part. And then usually out of sprint reviews and retrospectives, some sort of artifacts come out of those as well as end results. And of course, the most important artifact of all is the product that you're creating. And in our case, that's the game. So at the end of every iteration, you should have a new build of the game to play. The earlier you can get to a place where you're generating new version of the game after every sprint, the better off you are about delivering a game, which is ultimately the end goal. Some people argue that game isn't really the artifacts, it's the product. But I tend to keep it simple, that there's ceremonies and artifacts that are put together to form a process. So that's the Scrum cycle. And it matches very well with the conceptual loop we talked about earlier. So you set the goal and you plan here in the beginning. You then monitor and adjust in this loop. And then at the end, you deliver, and hopefully you remember to celebrate. So what would that look like in a calendar in a studio? I've taken a real world example of a studio where we ran multiple parallel Agile teams using a scaled Agile method called Nexus. So I've crossed out some of the Nexus stuff that is not within the scope of this lecture series to talk about how do you scale beyond one Scrum team. Once your teams get to that scale, we can talk about it. So we're talking about one Scrum team being ideally about 7 ± 2 people. So if you start to get way beyond 10 people, that might be a discussion we might want to have with some of your teams. And if you're in that situation, then let's have a a one-on-one coaching session with your team to talk about it. But this is how we broke it down into one studio. We would start a new sprint every 2 Wednesdays. So every 2 weeks, we would start a new sprint on Wednesday. We would start it with the retrospective of the previous sprints, and we would do the planning. And that would eat a big part of Wednesday, which is why we don't have a stand-up there. But then every other weekday, pretty much, we have a stand-up until the end of the sprint. And we have a weekly play tests on Fridays, as well as weekly backlog grooming sessions with a slightly different focus. On the first Thursday and the second Wednesday, we focus on the longer term backlog grooming. But on the last Monday before the end of the sprint, we focus on the backlog prioritization with the intent to have as smooth sprint planning as possible for the next sprint. So the focus is on making sure that we have the right items prioritized to go into the next sprint. So it's a much more focused approach into the short term next cycle. And then at the end of the sprint, we would run a sprint review. Now, often teams run their sprints from Monday to Friday, and that just seems sort of natural. But I found in most studios that it's actually better to break the sprint during the week instead of onto the weekend, and treat the weekend sort of being inside the sprint instead of where the sprint ends. I find that tends to favor a more robust working cycle in studios. But most studios that I know still run Monday to Friday sprints, but I have very many good arguments why I prefer something else. And we can discuss those in one-on-one coachings or in the Q&A if that's an area you want to focus on. Okay, so you plan, you monitor your plan, you adjust your plan along the way, and you review it at the end. Quite simple, right? And you can do all of these stages using your Hack and Plan tool that we've talked about in the past. Some teams are using other tools, but Hack and Plan is the one we recommended the program. It's the one that Shrey has been prepared to teach you and coach you on how to using. So talk to Shrey if you want help with Hack and Plan. And everything we do is assuming that you're using the free version of Hack and Plan, so you don't have to pay for that. Any questions or comments before we go into the next section?
Why do 2 weeks instead of 1 week?
Sorry?
Why do 2 weeks instead of 1 week? Like iteration cycles.
That's a very good question. So you have to balance two things. One, how long is your plan going to stay valid? And how long are your stakeholders willing to wait for the next build? Because usually the agreement in studios is that leadership is not allowed to change the goals of the team during that iteration. So the goal is locked for those 2 weeks and they get peace of mind to work on it. Then we can review it together. Then we get the feedback in business environment, and then we adjust. And that's giving some peace, because some studios are too agile where leadership thinks that they can change their mind on a dime and they keep changing it all the time, which creates this trashing effect that there's no progress being made because we keep changing which direction we're going, and the team is just going in place, trashing around like a fish out of water. So you have to balance that. How far can you plan ahead and stays valid? How long can your key stakeholders wait? The other thing you need to balance is the overhead. The sprint planning, the sprint review, those all add an overhead. And if your sprint planning and review both take one whole day and you do a sprint weekly, you spend 2 out of your 5 days. So 40% of your work time goes into overhead. And you have to balance that overhead with the amount of work that you're doing, with how long can the plan stay solid. Of course, you can make your sprint planning and review faster and more efficient over time, but those are all aspects that you want to balance out. If you can run a weekly cycle and the overhead is reasonable, then that gives you more adjustment points, especially in fast projects. like we are doing in the GameLAB. We looked at the clock for the entire year last time, and if you have 2 quarters and time is already ticking, we're halfway through April now, you have 5.5 months to finish production of the game. If you run 2-week sprints, that's about 11 sprints left for your production. If you run 1-week sprints, that's twice as many. And so it does give you more formal review and iteration points, but you have to balance that with the overhead. I'm not saying strongly one way or another, but I do recommend you would rather keep them short than long. Some teams like 1 month sprint cycles or even 6-week sprint cycles, but especially in your case where you have 6 months to do this, I would highly recommend to keep it to 2 weeks or maybe even less and not make it longer than that. You then want to build milestones on top of it, which can then be 1 month or 6 weeks or longer. And so multiple sprints then fit into one milestone. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Something in the chat. Our team has different times of working, so it's quite hard to plan daily stand-ups at the moment, but I like to add it to our workflow. Yes, this is one of those challenges in teams that are not full-time working on something and based on employment and payment of salaries is those times. And in salaried environments as well, when people are across different time zones, it does create these challenges. So, active communication, maybe in the retrospective of figuring out how to do it together, how to fit it into the calendars is a worthwhile effort. We have devlogs, but people forget to update those at the moment. Yeah, that tends to happen when you try to do it asynchronously by any other mean than talking to people directly. There's a very high chance that those get neglected over time, either by those who need to write them or those who need to read them and react to them. So it doesn't also help if people write their logs, but nobody reads those logs or nobody ever triggers a conversation or a response to those logs, and they just go sort of vanish into a black hole of nobody cares. So I do highly recommend synchronous catch-up moments, however you can fit them in your calendars. All right, let's move on. How do you then plan this iteration? Well, we talked about last week for the entire lecture about how to build a product backlog and how to maintain it. So we're not going to cover those today. Please watch last week's lecture if you want to go deeper into those. We're not going to talk about now how do you set that goal and plan for that iteration, that sprint, if you will, if you're using Scrum terminology. And that happens here. You take that product increment out of your product backlog, you do a more detailed planning on it, and that turns into your sprint backlog that you then execute against. I showed you this image last time. So you can think of your product backlog as a prioritized list of items. And if you've done your work well, you have broken the items at the top of your backlog to the appropriate size, and they're in the appropriate priority order, that it's easy and smooth to pull the top items from there into your sprint planning meetings. This is why in my sprint cycle that I showed you previously, the last backlog grooming session was focused purely on backlog prioritization. And it was focusing on making sure that these items here at the top of the list here were the right items in terms of priority, they were at the right size that they're easy to take into the sprint and so forth. So that was the main purpose and focus of those particular sessions. Okay. So then if you have identified those items, you can start breaking them down into more detailed tasks. And we talked last week about the difference between a prediction and a commitment. Everything in the backlog is a prediction, but I would like you to treat the sprint items that you generate. So not those green items only, but also those yellow items The yellow items are just the plan, how to get to those green items. The green items are the real goal. And I would like you to focus committing as a team to doing everything you can to deliver those green items, because they're the valuable ones. The yellow items are just a way to get to those green items. Well, then the next question is, how many of these should we take? You should think of the sprint as a time box. We talked about time boxing a little bit last week. You have a certain team size and a certain time. And of course, the team members are not interchangeable. Somebody's a programmer, somebody's an artist. You all have different skill sets and abilities. You have to take that into account as well. But if I slightly make it simplified, you have a certain team size and a certain time, whether that's 1 week or 2 weeks, that defines the size of the box. And then you use your items from your backlog to fill it in. Not all the way to the brim. There can be some room left, which is symbolized here by the dotted line at the end. When the next item goes over, you stop. And what is the number you're aiming for? That's where we use what we call historical velocity data. How do you build historical velocity data? Well, first of all, over time, history is defining that it's something that happened in the past. Well, what is velocity? So for every sprint, whatever estimates you use in your backlog, keep them separate from your sprint estimates. Your backlog estimates, which here I'm calling story points, but doesn't matter what points you're using. There's some numbers that you're using, and you might be using the adjusted Fibonacci or some other number series to do that. You have a certain set that you're planning and committing to in a sprint, which is here represented by these blue lines or blue bars. Those are the plans you had originally in the sprint. The green ones are what you actually delivered. So you're always looking at what was the original plan, what was the ultimate delivery in that sprint. And then you use your delivered values and take an average of it, which is the dotted line. And that gives you the velocity data. You can use very complicated or very simple formulas to calculate your average. And I have created a version for you how to do this easily that should fit your purposes. So when it comes to Hack and Plan, Sheree is going to help you, but I have developed a Google spreadsheet template for you to use that I will be sharing with you after the lecture. And if we have time at the end of the lecture, I can show you how it works. I just don't want to be jumping between the presentation and that. But if we have time in the end, I will show you how it works. And me and Jones will share it with you afterwards. That makes it very easy for you to generate a graph like this and to observe and monitor your velocity and use that as a baseline. So you now have items in your product backlog that are of certain size, and you know the historical velocity data based on your previous sprints, how much work you've done. Even if you haven't had all of this backlog and things, you have done sprints and you have delivered some work. So if you want to generate historical velocity data that you don't have, is you could go back to your previous sprints and estimate some of those backlog items. So you could then use those prints already from Q1 when you're still working with Klaus and Jussi to generate some of the velocity data. Or you could start from best guesstimate how much you think you can fit into a sprint, do your first sprint based on that, and then use that first sprint as your one data point for your next sprint. So you then have this case where you know what your historical velocity data is, and you take a bunch of items from your backlog that fill in most of that sprint using that time boxing method. Now, what do you do with that remaining bit with a question mark? If you pull in an item that doesn't fully fit, is that a good idea or a bad idea? That depends how aggressive you want to be. If you want to be conservative in your sprint goaling, and you know that you always have a tendency to underestimate things, you might want to say, no, let's not take more. Let's make sure that we deliver these to quality. Or you can say, like, oh no, let's push ourselves and be more aggressive. I often use here a method that I call it a stretch goal. Okay, those items that fully fit into the time box, We call them the goal, and that's a commitment that we do everything to hit. The stretch goal is more an extra challenge for us, that we will only start working on that item if and when we have either delivered all these other things, or we are 100% confident that we will deliver, or some team members can no longer contribute to those items. We then can start working on the stretch goal with the full expectation that we won't be disappointed if we don't fully finish it in this sprint. And that's a way for you to challenge and over time try to increase your velocity. Let's always take a little bit of a stretch goal and try to push our velocity and find the best velocity for your team. At a certain point, you will push your team so far that they will start breaking down under the stress. That's when you want to scale back. But as a company, if you want to be successful, you need to be pushing yourselves slightly beyond where you're comfortable, and you will be surprised how much more you can do as a team and individuals if you keep challenging yourself. It's the same thing in the gym. If you keep lifting the same weight all the time, you will not develop more muscle. You have to put in a little bit more weight. But if you put too much weight, you're going to injure yourself. And that's not good, because that's going to set you back a lot. So you don't want to burn out your team members, but you do want to challenge yourselves to become better and better as a team. Sometimes it comes just by challenging yourselves. Sometimes it comes by making improvements into the way you work, using those retrospectives as a tool to do that, as we discussed earlier. And I will talk more about retrospectives in future lectures. So that's one way to think about it, the concept of stretch goals. So let's remember that a sprint plan is a commitment to deliver. You're promising each other, and when you have investors, to your investors, that you are committed to delivering this. So that's a difference between the projection, which is your best effort estimation, and a commitment, which is a promise to deliver. We talked about it last week, but I wanted to remind you again. And I used this visualization of cone of uncertainty. Each of those zagged lines forms a new dotted line, which is a new potential future based on where that goes. And each one of those sprints is a commitment, and everything beyond is a projection. If you can get into this mindset and you can teach your stakeholders this mindset, you get to a healthier place, because often people who don't understand project management or don't even understand game development, they think that every roadmap you show them is a commitment, and they expect 100% adherence to a roadmap. I have never seen any game development team be able to hit every single item on time on their roadmap, which is the whole reason why we use Agile instead of waterfall planning, because it is so hard to predict the future to that level of accuracy in game development. All right, so we have commitment plus stretch goals. So we then treat this as the commitment, and this is as the stretch goal. The stretch goal is more like a prediction rather than the commitment, to not get ourselves into trouble. And that way we can have the best balance of having a solid commitment while still challenging ourselves to do more, and using the prediction to look into longer future and make the decisions we need to in terms of scoping of the game and everything else based on our best effort guesstimate, which we call prediction. And again, Hack and Plan is your tool here. Work with Shrey how to do all of this in Hack and Plan. So that's that section. How do you plan your iterations? Any questions or comments on this before we move on to how do you monitor it during the iteration? We have an optional text version of dailies, separate channel in Discord where we put our updates, like I worked on X, did Y, and tomorrow I will do, to help sync on things. Yeah, it can help. Not saying those things are bad, but they do not fully replace the benefits of having a synchronous communication moments along the way. Even if you can't do them daily, I highly recommend you find a way to do some of those. Anything related to sprint planning?
Who decides which items are chosen on that sprint? Like, is the person themselves committing, like, I can do this task, Or are we together as a team deciding together the amount of story points or hours or something?
So yes, and this is a bit tricky. So these items here in the backlog, I often recommend that they are player facing. What is the value they add to your players? Or if you're working on an internal tool, if programmer is making a tool for level designers to design levels for the game, then what is value to the level designer? That helps you define things in language that people can understand, people can evaluate, and we can make product decisions based on what we need for the product, not what an individual wants to do. Because at the end of the day, we're here to deliver a commercially successful game, not fantasy fulfillment for individual team members. The commitment, so often this item is not defined enough detail to really make a commitment. That's why we take it into the sprint planning and we break it down to individual tasks. So the work item should be owned by the entire team, and the team should be committing to that together, but the tasks can be individual. So if it requires programming work and artist work, an artist and programmer should break down their tasks and figure out in detail what those are. And then they should be the domain experts saying, do they believe they have enough time to do all of this work in this iteration? And if all of the different tasks can be done and everybody in the team feels comfortable enough, maybe not 100%, what is the percentage that you're looking for to commit to the actual entire item, then you commit to the entire item. If not everybody can commit to the item, then you might have to go and break down this item further during the sprint planning. That's why I'm saying that it's important that these are the right size as well as the right priority order. Because if these are broken down well enough, like you want to keep these that are lower in the priority big enough, so it's easier to maintain the backlog. If you have thousands or tens of thousands of items in your product backlog, it's a lot of work to maintain. The smaller the number, the easier to maintain, but you have to balance it with the fact that these are small enough. So my advice is usually that if the sprint, let's say easy numbers, your velocity is 10 in the last sprint, then I would make sure that there is 15 to 20 points, velocity points worth of items here broken down into maybe 3 points each maximum, so that you can fit at least 3 items into that sprint. Because then at least you can deliver one of those quite confidently, because that only requires 33% success. If you plan things that your sprint only includes one item and you fail to deliver anything of player value in the sprint. And that's why I'd always break them down so that you have at least 3 items per sprint, and you have at least 1.5 to 2 sprints worth of items here broken down into the right size and prioritized, because it makes this planning and this commitment so much easier. So by doing your backlog maintenance well and regularly, you make this planning during the sprint planning much easier. And that's one way to make the sprint planning faster. Remember when I said, if you're running 1 week sprints and you spend entire Monday sprint planning, you're probably in trouble because your overhead for the sprint is too much. Did that answer your question?
Thank you. It clarifies that we have been having tasks in the product backlog, and that makes it that people work towards different work items in a goal, and then that doesn't make the team fully committed towards the same goal.
Yeah, I haven't given you a lecture about what is teamwork, but to me, the difference between team and a group of people that loosely work together is the team shares a goal. That is one of the important things. If you don't share a goal, it's very hard to have teamwork. You don't have to act as a team, but I can guarantee that if you work as a team together, you have a higher chance of making a high quality game. If a programmer programs his tasks in one corner, of course he's going to feel like he doesn't have to communicate with the rest of the team because he has a clear task list ahead of him. But if he feels that he's responsible together with the rest of the team to deliver a work item that has value to the player that you committed to together, then he's by default more motivated to talk to everybody else who's also working on tasks towards that goal. It's more fun, and at the end of the day, for most of us, I know some are very introverted and they hate talking to human beings, but generally it's more fun. You don't feel so alone with it, and the game is going to be better. Every time a designer and programmer works closer together, not further apart, they will develop better features for the game. Every time an artist works closer with the programmer and the designer, the better the art will fit the intended gameplay of that thing. And they don't fight each other in terms of art style versus gameplay style, for example. So a nuanced thing, but actually very important for smooth collaboration and game health at the end of the day. Okay, any other questions? I'm so glad to have Riikka here. I think I commented last time that I wish Riikka was here because she always asks a lot of questions. It's much more fun for me when I get to interact with you a bit. Okay. Again, remember you can write questions in chat even when I'm talking, if you're shy. So let's move into how do you monitor during the iteration? Remember we talked about you don't just want to go on autopilot for 2 weeks and then at the end of the 2 weeks realize that, oh, we failed another sprint. Oh, we failed another sprint. Because every failed sprint is a lost opportunity to adjust along the sprint to get at least some of the success out of the sprint. And I sort of told you that answer. Why do we monitor the iteration? Forgot my own slides. So how does a project get to be a year late? It happens one day at a time. I know this book is old and you're probably like, oh, geez, that's older than my dad. I'm not interested. But there's still value to be had in old programming and IT literature. There's a very good book that I recommend everybody that has to work with any kind of software development, which games are also part of if you're making computer games instead of board games, is to read The Mythical Man Month. There's a lot of very good insights into there. How do you run programming teams, software teams? How do you project manage these things? So projects do not accidentally go over budgets, or they don't accidentally run over by months and months and months. Let's take GTA, for example. How many times did they move it? It happens in small increments, day by day, task by task, sprint by sprint. And by monitoring this closely, we can eliminate a lot of this waste. Not all of it, but we can eliminate a lot of this waste because we inspect the situation and we adapt. We apply this basic agile principle to maximize our learning as much about the game and the progress we're making as possible and soon as possible so that we can minimize the waste. And all of this is for the benefit of the game. The less time and energy we waste, the more time and energy we can put towards things that actually end up in the game, in players' hands. And if we also keep learning ourselves, then the game will be the best possible game we can make. If we don't react as soon as we know something is wrong, we are just wasting time and energy, putting it down something that might end up getting cut from the game because we're going in the wrong direction. And this is where tracking the sprint becomes is important. This is where the daily stand-ups and other communication and synchronization during the workflow happens. This is where the burn downs become so valuable. So remember, we have this. This is now what we are looking at. This is the plan we're going against. This is the commitment we came to. These are the product backlog items. We talked about them. We talked about those sprint tasks. We now put them on what I call a Scrum board. I know a lot of people, including many tools, call it a Kanban board, but it drives me nuts because then we confuse Scrum with Kanban. Kanban in its own method, and it has a different flow and purpose and intention and pros and cons. And I can talk a little bit about Kanban later, or we can have a whole session about Kanban with you guys. But what a lot of people, including I think Hack and Plan and Jira, both use the word Kanban, is actually a Scrum board. And this is my example of how I like to adjust my Scrum board. So within the sprint, I also make it clear what was the priority of the product backlog items, the PBIs that we pulled from the product backlog. If I have a team that delivers me a priority 4, but didn't deliver me priority 1, then I am not happy. Unless there was active communication along the way so that I can work with the team to try and adjust our plan. If they just deliver PBI 1 and nothing else, then at least I'm happier than just getting number 4, but I would still like to be notified during the sprint about the facts so that we can work together to try and make the best possible use of that time. And those items usually go straight in the flow, and we then map those tasks next to them. And we go from the backlog to work in progress to done at a very simple format, but often you can add other columns to it, whatever makes sense for your workflow. For example, when it's done, it can go ready for review for a team to play test it together in the game, for example. Or if you have a QA separate, it can go for ready for QA, it can go to in QA, and have different columns for how do you actually work as a team. And retrospectives are a great place to discuss what other columns you might benefit from in the flow. For example, if programmer always does something before then it goes to artists, then maybe there's ready for art pass. Or if a designer needs to make a design document before it goes to code, you can model some of that flow in your Scrum board if you have an active discussion of what adds value to you and what helps you monitor as work flows through. I call the last column done for a reason, because we often use done very vaguely. A programmer can say, oh, it's done. Okay, but does it actually do what the product backlog item is saying it should be doing for the game and for the player? Or does the programmer just mean that they have finished their tasks on it? So to define a definition of done, what do we mean by done, is very valuable. And it can be either the same definition all the time, or it can change based on the stages of the project. Earlier in the project, the definition of done can be looser, but then closer to shipping, you can up the requirements higher in relation to QA or in relation to polish levels or other things. And by having that either per phase or per item or per sprint, however, it's good to have an active discussion of what do we mean by done, because often we use that word, but we all mean different things, and that relates to miscommunication and frustrations and half-finished items, that all the tasks in the item are done, but the item itself is not done because the player can't really experience it in the game, right? So that focuses us all on delivering increments to the game, a new game build, not just finishing our individual tasks. And that again emphasizes the importance of teamwork over individual tasks. I often also have a bypass lane for high priority items, bug fixes, or other things that might take higher priority even than the PBI. If the game build is broken and nobody can play test the game, that might mean that it's more important than any new work going into the game. If the balancing tool is broken and the designer can't do his work, that might be more important for the programmer than any of the planned sprint tasks. And this bypass lane is good reason why you sometimes do not want to fill your entire sprint. So your velocity data was 10, but you're planning in 8 because you've seen that there's always some high priority items coming along during the sprint that you could not plan for in sprint planning. You might want to create this sort of bypass lane. And then I want to include a burn down, and I'm going to teach you how to make burn downs. In my advanced version, I like to have 3 trend lines and use windows for estimation, but that's an advanced technique that I'm not going to teach you, and it's beyond the scope of these lectures. But if you want to dig deeper into something like that, we can have that in one-on-one sessions with the team. But I expect all of you to use some form of Scrum board or something similar to track your sprint during it, and I expect all of you to make some kind of burn downs to track. Are you tracking close to goal or not, so that you can then potentially adjust. You can say, okay, let's stop all work on priority 4 item and focus all work on priority 2 and 1 and 2 to deliver at least those out of the sprint. And you can only have those valuable discussions as a team if you actively sync up, if you actively engage, if you actively monitor your progress so you can adjust it. And this sprint burn down is a very valuable tool. Again, I'm going to share with you a Google spreadsheet that is easy to create these graphs for you. And I expect you all to be sending those graphs my way in the future so that we can help you monitor your sprints and you can report progress to the coaching team about your progress. So some of this stuff you can do in Hack and Plan. There are some paid features to do some of this in Hack and Plan, but our baseline is that we're not mandating any use of any tools that cost you money, because the program is not paying for those. So free version of Hack and Plan plus the Google spreadsheet template I'm going to share with you should be enough to do this. Okay. Dailies. So often these are described as the questions you ask. I find that a bit robotic and formulaic. I would like to think of them as themes that you want to cover. What was done yesterday? What's going to be done? Are there any blockers? And what I like to add is, what's your confidence in hitting the sprint commitment? So every day, everybody in the team taking a critical view, are we on track to hit the commitment we made in terms of those PBIs, those product backlog items, those player-facing valuable things from the product backlog? Do we still have confidence we're going to deliver on all of them in this sprint? So I advise you not just repeat the mantra like a robot. I did yesterday, I will do tomorrow, I have no blockage except I need more oil. That's not beneficial and it gets boring. I'd much rather you have a more organic communication around those themes, right? So the things to think about, what did we accomplish yesterday? Ideally, we have finished the whole PBI item that we can move to a new state. Or what are the tasks I worked on? How much time was spent on those? How much effort is remaining? So we want to focus on how much time we spent on something, but then when we look into the future, we want to think about how much effort is remaining, because the task might have had 5 days left today. It might have 6 days left tomorrow because we discovered more work. That doesn't mean that we didn't do work. It just means we're always reevaluating how much work is remaining based on the information we have today, based on the learning we have done as teams and individuals. These you can then use to update your Scrum board to keep others informed. It's important because your work might have dependencies to others. It might affect upcoming play tests. It also might be that other people can help. They can prioritize their work differently to help you with some of those. Because remember, your goal is together deliver these PBIs to your definition of done, to get them fully done and in players' hands, rather than finish your individual tasks. This is to record the total effort spent. This is not to evaluate you or punish you for bad estimates. This is for you to improve the way you work, to better estimate in the future, so that you can in the future look at, okay, how did I estimate that? Why did I estimate it wrong? How can I estimate better in the future? Because that then improves your predictability going forward. So it's for you learning tool, not a weapon to attack each other for bad estimates or laziness. It's for helping better improve your skill at estimating. And that's important because even very professional, long-term professionals struggle with estimates. Estimation of future is extremely hard. Nobody's ever perfect at it. And then this helps you for that active reevaluation of how much work is remaining and if we're still on track to hit the sprint goal or if we should adjust our sprint goal. So how can that look like? We have here highlighted the task in pink. It's moving there. It's now under work. Original effort estimation is that there's 5. We have now spent some work on it, but hey, we only think there's 3 hours or days or whatever measure you use within the sprint. And remember to keep that separate from the units using in your backlog. That makes your work easier, trust me, even though it might seem like more work. You're moving it forward to where it is now in the flow. How much time do you think is remaining and how much time and effort you have spent on it? And that keeps you honest and gives you a chance as a team to reevaluate if you're on track or not. Something else might be moving to done, right? That's ultimately what you want to do. And then ultimately what you want to do is to get entire PBIs moved to done. And it might not make any sense to move them to the stages in between. You just keep them there until it's done. But again, the details how you want to use this tool, which I call an adjusted Scrum board instead of Kanban board, is up to you and your team. Start with something simple and only add different stages and layers to it when you find it valuable. But that's how the conversation and the thinking about the theme of what was accomplished yesterday reflects into the tool, right? And you should be able to do most of this in Hack and Plan. So then, what am I going to do today is looking into the future. That's again to update the Scrum board to keep others informed. That affects the dependencies, playtesting, and everything else. It also avoids duplicate work. It's good for others to understand that you're taking this work on now so that they don't also take on the same work. That's why you want those synchronous moments of communication. So do you all understand what others are working on so that you can support each other instead of duplicating effort and working on the same thing and creating merge conflicts and everything else when you try to submit your work. And again, how much effort is remaining in the thing that you just took, even if you didn't work on it yesterday, because that helps you reevaluate, are you still agreeing with the goal? Some of the other work you've done, some of the other learnings you've done might change your feeling on it. Even the fact who takes on the task, because we know that we're not created equal. Others are more experienced in programming or in design or whatever. They might be able to accomplish the same item faster than another person. So that might also affect the evaluation there. And again, you then want to move those items in your board and you want to reevaluate them. How much time is effort remaining? Okay. So next theme, blockers. Do I have any blockers? No one should ever be blocked. That should be rule number 1. If somebody can't do their work because they're blocked, you should investigate and deal with it immediately because you're wasting that person's time. Do not wait until the next daily. This is already something going wrong if you hear about blockers in the daily. As soon as there's a blocker, communicate it to your teammates ASAP. That's why I don't really like it as a theme for dailies, because it sort of tends to send a signal that you should just sit on your hands and do nothing and only raise the blocker issue in the next daily. No, raise it immediately with your team members. Don't be afraid to ask help. All of us can use help every now and then. So be proactive in asking and offering help to others. That, again, makes your team stronger. It emphasizes the teamwork, and it makes all of us more resilient to challenges and difficulties because we know we're not alone. So asking for help, how do you ask for help and how do you offer help is a valuable item to be discussing in your retros if it's not working, and maybe add it to your team charter. Remember that I want that team charter to be a living document that you keep adding to so that it serves your actual work. It's not just something you created once in the kickoff boot camp. It's something that I want you to keep maintaining over time. And if you know that you're going to cause blockers to others, if you think ahead and you know that, can you already prevent that from even happening by active communication, or at least mitigate it? So don't just block other people's work. If you proactively think about it beforehand, if I do this way, is it going to block somebody else's work? You might be preventing those blockers. And how the best way to deal with the problem is to prevent the problem from ever happening. So again, you should be reflecting that on the board here. Maybe have a different type of tag for your tasks when they're blocked. Maybe have a column for where you move things that they are blocked, so that you're signaling clearly to everybody, this is blocked, it's an ASAP item. Maybe it generates a new item to the bypass lane that needs to be dealt with so that the blockage can be removed ASAP. Of course, if the blockage is on priority 4 item, it might not be as important as priority 1. Maybe the person needs to shift to another task and we leave it blocked. But the key is that we actively communicate about it as soon as we know that something's blocked so that people don't waste time waiting, but they do something valuable while it's being blocked. And again, there's different ways you could do this in Hack and Plan. How do you signal that blockage? All right. The confidence is something that basic Scrum does not describe. It talks about those other themes that we just talked about, but I think this is probably the most important theme to think about because it helps then adjust those sprint plans. With some teams, we talked about how they usually reach 30% of their sprint goals. Well, if you planned for a 6-month game project for production and you hit about 30% of your sprint goals, to me, that's a signal that you have to cut 2/3 of your content away, right? That might require drastic redesigns for your game. So you want to get to the top of that to get the clarity of what is your true velocity of delivering value into the game build so that you can make the tough decisions earlier. Because I would rather have that you ship a smaller game and have time to polish it and bug fix it in the end than you make something too big that you don't have time to finish this year. Remember, the goal of the GameLAB year is to give you as a team the positive experience of shipping a game. And then in future years, build on that success with maybe more ambitious projects, maybe more commercial projects. So to me, number one goal is to ship a game, any game, while Klaus and others are trying to help you make it as commercially viable as possible. But to me, the number one goal is shipping a game to begin with. And number two goal is that it's a commercially viable game. So re-examining and evaluating daily if we're still along the way, and then adjusting as soon as possible when you feel unconfident about hitting it. And a very simple tool for that to do very quickly, whether you do that on Slack or Discord or face-to-face in a meeting, you just go 3, 2, 1, and you use a thumb to signal the high confidence level. If everybody's green, nothing to discuss, move forward. If anybody's yellow or red, try to dig into those reasons why and what to do about them. But try to be honest and self-reflective of it. Don't just put a thumbs up because you don't want to have the conversation and deal with it and try to hide the challenges you're facing from the rest of the team. Be brutally honest, raise the issues early, and you will have more successful sprints, and you will ultimately have a more successful game, and ideally then more successful company. All right, we're running a little long, so I'm going to keep going without asking questions, but we'll try to do some questions and answers in the end. So how do you then adjust during it? We've talked about the monitoring, now we're talking about the adjust part. By adjusting along the way, we minimize that waste so that we can deliver something better rather than delivering nothing. That's often for others that they can work on it, that it can be play tested and so forth. There's a saying in Agile that parts on the garage floor are worthless. It's only the work that gets delivered to definition of done that adds value. This is not a car. You can't drive it. It doesn't take you to work. It just takes a bunch of waste of space and money to have that at your home. It's useless. You'd rather have a 3-wheel car than no car at all. Sure, it's not as nice as some of these cars, but they all take you from place A to place B. Same thing with games and game features. Even a less fleshed out version of that feature can be play tested, and it's worth something, than a very ambitious, cool feature that never gets accomplished, never gets finished, is never play testable. And the longer it remains untestable in the game build, the more risk there is that you're building something that you're ultimately going to say, not good, kill it and start over. So the worst case scenario is that you have a bunch of parts on the garage floor. None of the PBIs are at the final column. This is a worthless sprint to you. It doesn't give you information. It doesn't help you make the game. This is already at least partially successful sprint, and it's the most likely scenario that you will be facing most of the time in game development, that you get some of the items done and some of them do not get finished. And when we then look at velocity data, we give you points only for those PBIs that were finished. So the velocity tracking sense that you're not fooling yourself by overly optimistic numbers, you give yourself a 0 points of velocity for priority 3 and 4 here, because you didn't fully finish them, even if you finished some tasks. You might take those items to the next sprint, but they might be higher priority items instead that you're going to take into the next sprint. Those might go back to the backlog for a very long time, and they might be even cut from the game. So any work done on those is potential waste, and you should have prioritized the work in priority 4 into priority 3, and you might have been able to finish priority 3. Best case scenario, of course, is this, but it's quite rare, and it offers a signal that you have not been ambitious enough in pushing your velocity. So some level of this is okay. You just don't want to end up like this. That's a failure, and this is the ideal case, but often not achievable. But if 30% of your stun is in done column and 60% is in the backlog still, then that's not a good place. If you're maybe 75 to 90% done, then that's probably the ideal thing that you should be aiming for at the end of sprints. So how do you do the adjustment during the sprint? Well, it's quite simple. You know that you're running out of time. You don't have confidence. If you've done your backlog planning, backlog grooming correctly, and you've done your sprint planning correctly, and you've maintained the priority of the PBIs even during the sprint, and you've focused on your work mainly on the highest priority PBI items, you can just cut entire PBIs before you even started working on them. And you focus on delivering the rest for the rest of the sprint. So those ideas, those are kind of went back to the product backlog, and you'll come back to them in your backlog groomings, and you'll come back to them in the future sprint plannings. But for the sake of this sprint, you're now focusing the entire team's resources on a smaller deliverable. And it's easier to do if you've done this prioritization right to begin with. So remember that delivering something is better than delivering nothing of value to the player. It gives others something to work on in the future sprints because of dependencies potentially between those items, and it gives you something to play test in the build. So actively do this work in Hack and Plan and in Google Sheets. Again, I will be providing those templates after this lecture. All right. I think we will stop it there, and we will finish these topics as well as go into the next part. I originally planned us to finish this today as well, but I wanted to have that interactivity, and with the interactivity comes the risk that we're not fully on schedule, but that's okay. We still have at least 2 more lectures in the calendar that we can continue these topics on. So I will look at the questions, and then I will quickly show you the templates. Do you reevaluate time task takes when you move it to WIP or in sprint planning? So you create the task in sprint planning and you give it the original estimate. Every time, whether it moves between columns or not, every day it's okay to reevaluate it, especially if you're working on it that day. So it's not about moving it from one column to another. Every day you're involved with the task, you should be reevaluating that task. It's okay also to reevaluate other tasks, because the tasks often have dependencies between them, and working on one task usually gives you more information. You're learning about those other tasks. Hopefully that answered your question, Ville. Do milestones differ from OKRs? Is one more for planning and the other more for monitoring? So milestones are kind of like the metaphor comes from roadsides. Roadsides used to have milestone markers, these stones that showed you how many miles or kilometers to the next town or wherever. Now they're replaced by those signs next to the road that show you that. And in English vocabulary, they still talk about milestone markers, and in some countries they still exist. But it's just sort of a road sign that tells you how far you are from somewhere. In project management, we use milestones for certain bigger things. For example, we can use them for just sort of buckets that we have multiple sprints that form a bigger milestone, and we use them to track and communicate to people outside. Often milestones are easier to communicate to people outside the team, like stakeholders, than sprints. You can also use milestones to hit certain key dates. Let's say the entrepreneurship night in May, you want to have a solid build to show there and to get people to play test it and give you feedback. Well, that would be then your milestone, that you have a milestone to deliver a solid build for that thing. And then you can think about what items are important to include into that milestone. Or you could be going to GDC and showing demos there to publishers. Then you would want to have a milestone build for that trip, and so forth. So milestones can either be just buckets at a regular interval. For example, if you're working with a publisher, you usually need to deliver a milestone for them to give you money. So then you might want to be delivering monthly milestones so you get monthly payments into your bank account so that you can pay salaries. Or you could be running quarterly milestones with bigger scope and a more heavyweight approval process on the publisher side. But those are then the discussions between your stakeholders and within your team. So either use them as buckets or use them as payment modules, payment deliverables, or use them as real world deliverables because you need to have the Halloween mode before Halloween, or you need to have the GDC build ready before GDC. So then you paste those along the project, and that gives you those larger things to aim for. So you have your ultimate goal of shipping the game, you have a milestone at an intermediate, and then you have the sprint at a couple of week schedule, and then you have your individual PBIs and tasks within them. So it's like an onion, layer of onions at different levels of time and complexity that you're focusing on deliverables. And that gives you better guidance in being able to hit your goals and deadlines. Is it viable to use milestones as sprints? One stall is one sprint. Sure, but what's the additional value of the milestone and sprints? Now, again, if you're delivering milestones to publisher, that might make sense. But I would argue, why would you not want to have at least 2 sprints within the milestone? Because then you essentially get that inspect and adapt point. Okay, we finished first sprint of this milestone. How well are we doing? Do we still want to keep adding the things to this milestone, or is it better to focus the second half of this milestone to polish what we have already built, right? So yes, you can inspect and adapt during the sprint, but you always have a bigger moment, more rigorous moment of the ceremony of reviewing things at the end of the sprint. So I would always urge to have multiple sprints to a milestone. It's not unheard of that they're the same thing, but then you could argue what additional value does that milestone bring you if it's the same thing as a sprint. Hopefully that made sense. Okay, I am gonna stop sharing this and I will show you the template quickly before we run out of time, and you can maybe start learning it, and then if you played around with it, you have more well thought out questions and challenges with it next time. So you can all use Google Spreadsheet for free. Thank you, Google. It has 3 tabs here at the bottom. This is the velocity data. I know it's a bit hard to see, but on my laptop, so it's hard for me to show. But it draws you this graph. It shows you what you committed and what your actual deliverable was and what the average is in a graph format. It does the math here. All you have to do is adjust these yellow formulas here. If I put a number here, it immediately draws a thing there. Pretty easy. And you can see that it recalculates your average there. Like that. I have only included 14. If you know anything about spreadsheets, it's easier for you to add more than 14. But at the same time, I figured 14 sprints is enough for most of you, since we are only doing a 6-month project. But if you want, you can make it longer. If you don't know how, you can ask me or Sheree for help, and we can adjust it for you, or maybe some other team. I'm pretty sure most of you know how to use spreadsheet enough to do that. Okay. There's 2 more tabs. Sprint burn down graph. Again, you only need to really touch the yellow ones, and I'm again assuming a 2-week sprint. It's relatively easy to change the sprint length. From here, we can do 7 days, for example, and then adjust the graph. I haven't allowed longer than 14, but again, you can make this table longer than 14 days quite easily if you know anything about Google Spreadsheet. But if you're okay with maximum 2-week sprints, you can make your sprint length here, and then you can make your original sprint commitment in backlog points. I'm calling them sprint points. So whatever units you're using for your sprint, whether you're using days or hours or whatever, these are the numbers in your tasks, not in your product backlog items. And then you can look at how you're burning through it. If you want, you could, in theory, do this same graph for every single PBI in your sprint and track them separately, if that helps you track those individually. But at minimum, I require you to make 1 sprint burn down for everything in your sprints. Okay? And it draws you 2 trend lines. And maybe, how do I demonstrate this easiest? If I put 10 here, and I put 5 here, and 3 here, and 1 here, you see that it starts to change, right? And it's one of the trend lines is just taking the length of the sprint divided by the original points, and it just draws a line if you had went at a constant velocity. Whereas the other graph is trying to estimate where are you going to be hitting 0 at this velocity, right? So if you don't know how to use those trend lines, I can help explain them in one-on-one coaching sessions, and we can maybe discuss this further next time. But it sort of gives you an idea if you're hitting your goals or not, right? You see that the blue line is predicting that you're going to take 14 days to finish your sprint with this, whereas you should be finishing at 13 if you are closing your sprint there. But if we go like this, oh, did I break something? No, okay. We put here some random numbers. You can see that the red line goes way out. There's no chance you're going to hit. So you want to get your red line hitting your blue line or finishing before your blue line, then you're on track to finish your sprint. If your red line starts to go longer than your blue line, then you're not on track to hit your sprint. And we use the very same format for milestones. Again, I'm assuming that your milestones are roughly 1 month long at least, so I've only included 7 milestones for your next 6 weeks of production. Again, you can easily make them longer, but if you don't want to, you can put your number of milestones here that you're aiming to do, and you can use the yellow ones to put the actuals from your milestones, and that's it. The original one here comes from here, so you can put it there. And this is now PBI points. So this is the points from your product backlog items. And this is looking at your entire product. How are you burning towards finishing everything in your backlog, right? This is to try and manage your scope so that you start scoping your game down early, because I can guarantee you that any inexperienced team will have too big ambitions most professional teams have too big ambitions as well in terms of scope, and they have to actively cut the scope down to be able to ship the game on time. As we talked last time, you have to think of your team size, budget, and schedule as fixed in this GameLAB to be successful, and your scope adjustable so that you can finish it on time. And I'm very glad to see that we still have everybody, all 15 people here, even though we went 4 minutes over. So that's the template in its simplicity. Hopefully it's easy enough to understand. If not, me and Shrey can help support. I can answer your questions about the template next time. I will be sharing that with Jones later today, together with the video of this thing. Jones and Riikka will put the video up onto the YouTube channel as soon as possible, and they will share you that template in whatever format that they usually share files with you. I want to thank you for your time today. We will continue next week. We will finish the section on sprints before moving on to the next bits. We have a section on how to review sprints left. And then next time on after that, we go into roadmap planning, continuous improvement, and how do we expect you to report your progress to the coaches. And that should cover most of what we had planned. So I on purpose scheduled 4 sessions, and I have 3 of these sets. So while we're slightly behind schedule, we have a whole session to catch up, which I was mainly going to use for questions and answers and more interactivity. So I'm confident that we can still wrap this up in 4 lectures. And then we can go into individual coachings per team as the teams desire and need in the future. And that, of course, includes also the incubation and acceleration teams. So once you've gotten this baseline knowledge, if you want more help with your planning and roadmaps and backlogs and everything, me and Shrey are here to help.